Herman Miller's story, written and narrated by Kathy Corder, based on interviews conducted by Tim Brooks and Shirley Gaber. The original settlers of North Florida were rugged individuals whose commitment to the earth and each other allowed them to prosper in this uncivilized but fertile land. George Herman Miller, a direct descendant of these early pioneers, instilled in his children and grandchildren the same tenacious work ethic and toughness that could only be learned from close ties to the land. This pioneer spirit runs consistently throughout the Miller lineage, a reminder that no tie is stronger than that of family. George Herman Miller was born on February 2nd, 1893, in Havana, Florida. One of 7 children, Herman grew up in a time when there were no cars, no telephones, no hard roads. He got around with buggies and wagons. Herman's father, George Washington Miller, grew tobacco and cotton and ran a sawmill on a 250-acre tract of land in Gadsden County. When tobacco and cotton were no longer profitable, Herman's father grew corn that was ground into grits and meal, using a water mill. George Washington and Mattie Miller raised Herman and his brothers and sisters in a small log cabin. Herman went to Poplar Springs, a one-room schoolhouse with a little wood stove. As a young man, Herman hunted for turkey on his daddy's land and made trips to the Gulf Coast, where his dad traded sweet potatoes and syrup for mullet. Each year, after the crops came in, Herman and his dad would make the trip to the coast. Since the journey took 3 days using a mule team and wagon, they camped on the way. They spent one night in Shadeville, inside the school. When they arrived at the Gulf Coast, they'd trade the sweet potatoes and syrup for mullet. They split the mullet in fish roe and salted it for keeping, as there was no ice back in those days. Like many young men living in the South at the time, Herman became a farmer. Then, on June 28, 1914, the First World War erupted, following the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Herman's call to duty did not come immediately, however. Nearly 4 years later, in the spring of 1918, Herman received his letter indicating that he had been drafted. At the age of 25, Herman left his home in Havana, Florida for France, where he would spend the next year. According to Herman, "It took me about 2 weeks to get over there. The whole ocean was lined up with floating mines. We had to go way out of the way to France to miss the floating mines. They put some minesweepers in there, but it took them a while to figure out how to do it. Then they could send the ships straight across." At one point on the trip to France, the men on his ship witnessed the surfacing of a German submarine, although there was no altercation. When Herman arrived in France, he was placed in the 28th Division K Company from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He described his training in the forest of France. "They put us out in the country there and learn us how to shoot guns, how to fight with bayonets, how to put your gas mask on. I was in the machine gun company a while. It took 4 men, 1 to tote water, 1 to tote ammunition, 1 to tote the frame, 1 to tote the machine gun. I was in the machine gun company a month or 2. Not long after Herman completed his training in the forest of France, he became ill with the mumps. He was taken to a hospital where he spent several weeks. After recovering from a 4-week bout with the mumps, he became ill with the flu that stayed with him for 5 more weeks. After Herman's 9-week recovery period in the hospital, he found himself in the Argonne Forest 3 days before the armistice. We got up there about 3 days before the war ended. We was in the second wave while the 109th was chasing the Germans. We was in the next wave running behind them. I could see them running over the hills, but they said, "Don't shoot till you get your orders, because you might shoot your own men." One day, shortly before the armistice, Herman and the other men had walked all day in the Argonne forest before stopping to camp for the night. "Our company camped in a piece of woods aside the road," Herman said. "There were big old trees, and it was below zero, and we were sleeping in tents. 2 boys would put 2 tents together, and 2 soldiers would sleep together. They had a bunch of blankets, and you put your overcoat and your raincoat over you, and you still couldn't get warm." Around midnight, the major come down the road on a horse. He got up there and hollered to get all of the men out of the woods in 5 minutes. The Germans were about to shell the woods. I had never been to sleep. All I had to do was put on my overcoat, roll my blanket up, and throw my packet on my shoulders, grab my gun, bayonet, and my gas mask. I was close to the major's horse. I held onto the saddle, and the horse helped me to run. We got on down the road about a mile or 2 and camped again. The Germans shelled that piece of woods about an hour after we left it. 3 days later, Herman and the other members of the 110th Infantry returned to the campground that had been shelled. Nothing but tree stumps remained. As it turned out, a German prisoner had warned Herman's superiors that the Germans had plans to shell the woods. Herman said appreciatively, "That German saved our lives." Mealtime in the Army was more appetizing than one might think. According to Herman, they had sugar kettles, they put beef in there cut all up, and they would put peeled potatoes in there and salt them. They would cook the potatoes and the beef together, and you come along with your plate. 2 dippers full would fill up your plate. You would have your knife and fork in your pocket. We had a cup that hung on our belt made out of some kind of metal, and it would hold nearly a quart. We had good coffee and potatoes and beef. Some days we'd have vegetables if we could get them. Once the armistice was signed, Herman and the rest of his division were forced to wait for several months before they could be shipped home. Herman recalled, "We had to wait 6 months after the war ended to get a boat home. They couldn't send them all back at one time." While waiting on their boat back home, Herman and the rest of his division stayed in a small town in France. According to Herman, they got permission from some woman who had a big upstairs barn full of hay. "Our company, 250 of us, slept up in that hay. We'd go upstairs in the hay barn and pull the hay down and pull the blanket on that hay. I had 2 blankets, and the soldier with me had 2. We would put the blanket on the hay, take our shoes off, but sleep in our clothes. It was warm up there with your clothes on. It was below zero the whole winter. It started getting cold in September." Meanwhile, the men built temporary barracks for sleeping and dining. After the barracks were finished, Herman and his friend Wesley Pope continued to sleep in the woman's barn while eating daily meals in the barracks. Eventually, Herman and Wesley quit going down there to eat. The woman was a wealthy farm woman. She had 2 kids, and her husband was in the war, and he hadn't come home yet. That woman had plenty of meat and lard and plenty to eat. She told us to come on in and eat at the table with her. They killed some hogs, she sliced it real thin and cooked some eggs, and she had some chickens too. We'd eat good old bacon meat and eggs and French bread and good coffee. She wouldn't charge us a thing. One night the woman woke up Herman and his friend Wesley. She knocked on the door and said, "My husband has come home from the war. I want you to come down and meet him." We went downstairs and met her husband. He was a nice fella, too. A few days later, Herman and Wesley thanked the woman for her kindness and made their way to the west coast of France for the trip home to America. We had to wait 3 more weeks when we got there. When Herman arrived in Havana, Florida, he returned to his life as a farmer. He bought a new buggy and a horse. It had rubber tires, an umbrella, and fringe. While courting Leila Ada Dawkins, Herman took her for rides in the buggy. We'd just ride around, we'd visit neighbors, and kill time. All the roads were dirt. Finally, Herman swapped the horse and buggy for his first car, a Ford Model A. Herman and Leila were married in 1922 in McRaeville, Georgia. Herman was 29 and Leila was 20. At first, Herman worked as a superintendent on a farm, growing tobacco, corn, and peanuts. Herman and Leila raised a family of 5 children with limited income. The Miller family had plenty of food, but they didn't have any money. Fortunately, the merchants in Havana provided credit for the heads of those families who were good for their word. Herman also worked as a carpenter on the side, as he couldn't make a living strictly on farming. One November morning in 1928, a fire broke out in their home, destroying everything. According to Leila, who had been in the yard working, when I got there, the house was falling in. Herman got there in time to save the car. With no roof over their heads and no clothes, Leila and Herman began the process of rebuilding their home. They started by buying each of their 5 children a supply of clothes. Leila also shared. We went to the Baptist church, and we hadn't been in a while, so they forgot about us, I guess. After the fire, Herman built his own house on a 20-acre tract that he had bought from his brother. We cut down the lumber and built the house, Herman shared. We had our own steam-driven sawmill. Big oxen pulled the logs to the mill. During this time, Herman also received a $960 bonus from the U.S. Armed Services for the time he spent in France during World War I. Herman used this additional income to help him build the house. Herman and Leila went on to lead fulfilling lives, raising 5 children and 14 grandchildren. The Miller grandchildren spent afternoons on the river with Herman fishing for brim. On many warm summer nights, they climbed the treehouse in his backyard, skinning knees and bare feet on the bark. And then there were the Sunday dinners where the family gathered around a table laden with fried chicken and fresh corn and peas from Herman's garden. In the last 5 years of Herman's life, his 5 children individually took turns living with Herman and his wife Leila, assisting them with the daily routine of their lives. Each sibling spent a week in Herman's house every 5 weeks. Herman's routine consisted of watching professional baseball games on television, playing pool in his garage, working in his backyard garden, or playing turkey in the straw on his fiddle. On his centennial birthday, Shirley Gaver asked him the secret to his longevity. He replied by saying, "I worked hard all my life. I eat sweet potatoes every day. I also love a mess of collards or rutabagas with some good old country ham." When Herman passed away at the age of 103 in 1996, he and Leila had been married for 74 years. Leila and Herman's children, grandchildren, nephews, and nieces gathered in a quiet little cemetery in rural Havana to say their goodbyes. Everyone wondered on that day how Leila would move on without Herman beside her. In 2001, the children and grandchildren all met again in the Shelfer Cemetery to lay Leila to rest. For all the descendants of George Herman and Leila Dawkins Miller, the legacy continues. It is a proud legacy built around family, loyalty, and strength.